All right, so we are picking up in our study of the book of 2 Samuel. We are picking up in chapter 15, and we're going to begin in verse 30. Remember that at this point in David's life, things are not going well for him. Certainly we saw things go very poorly for David in a lot of ways in the book of 1 Samuel, especially when it dealt with his relationship with Saul. But in this particular point, David has a lot of problems that have basically been created as the consequence of his own sin. And for David in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and the chapters moving forward, right, who's his biggest opponent? His own son, Absalom. So much so that David naturally has to basically leave. We saw that Absalom has won over the hearts of the people by basically stepping in and, as we noted, perhaps maybe clearing up or maybe fixing a problem that David had not paid attention to, bringing justice to people that came to Absalom, and Absalom won over the people at the beginning of chapter 15 in that way. So much so that Absalom had the support, overthrows his own father. Basically, at this point, has taken the kingdom for himself, and David naturally has to be on the run, just as he had been at one point in his life when Saul sought to take his life. Now, while David's on the run, the Bible notes, and we've seen already, and we'll see again today, that David was not alone in his fleeing from the city of Jerusalem. Right? He's not alone because, as we're going to see, God's certainly behind and providing support to David. You know, even though David's committed this great sin, and we'll see this, again, we see this moving forward, but even though David's committed this great sin, we don't see God abandon him, like he did with Saul, perhaps, where, again, God had, through Samuel, had chosen David to be the next successor as the king. God didn't choose Absalom in that sense, like he chose David. And so God's still going to be behind David and helping him out. But David also has several different allies that are going to come to his support, which we've already seen that last week. Certain of the Philistines that had come over with David after he had served in the Philistine army and had basically come and when he became king of Jerusalem, there were people of the Philistines that converted to Judaism and then came and were a part of the nation of Israel. Those people are going to remain loyal to him. We saw last week in verse 24, who else was going to remain loyal to David? Zadok, the priest, all the Levites that were with him, right there. They're thinking about, taking the Ark of the Covenant of God, taking it away, and taking the Ark on the run with David. And again, part of that was the idea that the priest and the Levites were going to show loyalty to David rather than loyalty to Absalom. But again, remember that David basically says to keep the ark where it is. And we talked about how for David, he recognized that he was not going to treat the ark of God like it was some good luck charm, like what the sons of Eli did back in 1 Samuel 4. Right? Well, they were very rebellious, very sinful. They thought that if they just take the ark with them into battle, doesn't matter how they're living, we're going to win. Well, it didn't happen. And David, on the other hand, doesn't do that. Leave the ark where it is. David understands, and that's because really that David understands that what is happening to him goes all the way back to what Nathan told him, that because David committed adultery, had Uriah killed, the sword would not depart from his house. David understood that what he's going through is the consequences of his sin. But we're going to see that the important thing behind this is that David, while he is, as we'll see, sorrowful for what he's done, he doesn't turn his back on the Lord permanently. He's not going to lose his trust in God, and that's something that we're going to note in one particular psalm that is recorded for us in the book of Psalms. So let's begin 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 30. Again, we remember that David at this point is on the run. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up, and he had his head covered and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads and went up, weeping as they went up. And then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Note where David is traveling here. Again, he is, as we mentioned last week, he's basically fleeing the city of Jerusalem and he's heading east. That would be towards the Jordan River. And one of the more notable locations that is east of Jerusalem, in between Jerusalem and the Jordan River, was the Mount of Olives. Now, where else have we heard about the Mount of Olives before? The New Testament, right? And specifically, what individual in the New Testament? Jesus, right? So, it is kind of an interesting thing to compare here. David and his party are very sorrowful because of what has happened. And so they travel to the Mount of Olives, and David, remains there at least for a while when he's going to hear this news in verse 31. He remains there for a while, being in a state of great sorrow. Well, I want you to turn for a moment in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26. Because in the New Testament, where the Mount of Olives is mentioned, it's mentioned on different occasions, but the most notable occasion perhaps occurs in Matthew chapter 26 and verses 30 and down through verse 35. Now, at this point in the book of Matthew, Jesus has instituted what we know to be the Lord's Supper in the verses prior to verse 30. But in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 30, note again, Jesus is with the apostles. They sung a hymn. They went to the Mount of Olives. And here, one of the more notable events in Peter's life occurs where Jesus is basically, again, going to remind Peter that you might be loyal now, but you're not going to be loyal when push comes to shove in a little while. Right, verse 31, Jesus said to them, All of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. And again, notice what Peter said here. Peter answered and said to him, Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And Jesus said to him, Assuredly, I say to you that this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. Now, note that again, this is the final moments of Jesus' life. Now, whereas the apostles don't really recognize what's about to happen, we know that if you read on through Matthew 26, Jesus goes to Gethsemane. Remember that he's in a very sorrowful state because he's human. He knows what's about to happen. And I think it's kind of an interesting comparison that Jesus, who was a descendant of David, and was in a sense a type of David, at least when it came to the concept of types and antitypes, that they both went to this same location in a state of sorrow. David because of his own sin perhaps, but Jesus because of his willingness to die to solve the problem of man's sins, as we know that he did on the cross. Again, and when you go back to 2 Samuel 15 and verse 30, note that David, it says that he had his head covered and that he went barefoot. Again, typically, especially when a man covered his head, that was, again, a process of a sign of mourning, just like the tearing of clothes, just like remaining dirty. That was a sign of mourning. The concept of going barefoot as well would also be used to show the idea of a humiliated position or a sorrowful position. In the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah 20 and verse 2, God would use Isaiah in a physical sense by telling him to go basically naked and barefoot to demonstrate what would happen to the nations of Assyria and Egypt when Babylon would eventually take them into captivity. And so the point being is that was a sign that Isaiah was to show that these people were going to be humbled and brought to a sorrowful state, just like David has here. But things again, only are going to get worse, at least it appears right offhand. So all the people that are with him are in the same position. They covered their heads. They're weeping as they go up. Then someone comes, tells David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now, why would that be such a hurtful thing for David to have to hear?
He had been very loyal to David, and his counsel, his wisdom. I mean, David leaned on him for that.
Yeah, exactly. Ahithophel had been one of David's closest advisors while he had been king. Again, he had relied on the wisdom of Ahithophel on other occasions in his life up to this point. And now all of a sudden, one of David's closest friends, one of his closest advisors, has basically turned on him and has now supported Absalom in his rebellion. And again, naturally, when you think about the entire context here, for David, having to lose a close friend like this to betrayal is not a very pleasant thing. But fortunately for David, again, we're seeing all these allies who are coming to support him despite the people of Israel turning against him. And we'll speak more about that in a moment. But notice that David would say, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, the understanding of that verse is pretty simple, right? David wants basically Ahithophel to become a bad advisor to Absalom, to give bad advice, because that could potentially help out David. Now, one of the things that you see here that we can point out is that God, and this is going to come out in verse 32, but God's going to providentially answer David's request in his prayer by the individual that we see David meet in verse 32, which we won't talk about the event between Hushai and Ahithophel until we get into chapter 16. But it's important for us to remember that David, even though he is struggling with the consequences of his own sins, he does not turn his back on God at all. Saul had done the same thing, or Saul had done the opposite of that, rather, right? Saul committed sins, but his perspective in life was to turn his back on Samuel, to turn his back on to God. As we saw in one chapter, Saul, because he's been rejected by God, goes and tries to find wisdom in the process of idolatry. It doesn't work out for him. But again, one of the reasons why David was a man after God's own heart is not because he was perfect, but even in a situation like this, where he recognizes that he is being punished, he doesn't turn this back into anger at God, right? David's one who at this point in his life acknowledges his own faults. I have suffered and I am suffering because of the consequences of my sin, right? That's why he told them to keep the ark there. Remember that David had said earlier in the book of 2 Samuel verse 15, carry the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. And David is keeping that entire perspective in mind. If I do return back to Jerusalem and I do become king, it's because this is what God has wanted. And so David, while he is very sorrowful, never turns his back on God. And that's where I want us to look at Psalm chapter 3 for a moment. Because again, a lot of people in life, when things go bad, their response is to turn that and to start blaming God for the situation that they're in. Now, sometimes we suffer in life because of things that are outside of our control, but we do know that sometimes we can suffer in life because of the consequences of sin. And that particularly applies to David here. But note how David handles this situation when he is weeping and he's sorry and he's in a very vulnerable state at this point in his life. Look at Psalm chapter 3. Notice that the subscript or the superscription there at the top says that this is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. Now, a lot of people think this is the context when he wrote this song. Notice what David says. Lord, how they have increased to trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. Naturally, that would probably apply that David's thinking about the people of Israel there, right? Many have rose up against me. We've seen Absalom win over the people, and when they could take the city, and when David had to flee. Again, many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. Remember, Ahithophel had been one of his closest advisors, gave him great advice from God. Naturally, he's not there anymore. But notice what David's response is to that. Verse 3, but you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of tens of thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. And so with David's opponents that he was facing right now, he never lost sight of the fact that if it was within God's will to protect him, to bring him back, God would go and fulfill that. Not at any point in this time do we see at least David show any significant form of a loss of confidence in God's ability to help him out. Now that's very important for us to remember, especially in the context of sin, because we all fall victim to the problem of sin. Right? Paul summed that up very well. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all are going to deal with sin at some point in our life. But the example that David is setting for us here is, how do we respond to the problem of sin? We shouldn't feel ashamed or embarrassed or that God doesn't care about us anymore because perhaps in life we are suffering because of our sins. That's not the approach that David took here. David continued to rely on the help and trust of God. And we're going to see the benefits of that pay off, not only here, but later on down the line. So keep that in mind. David and his people are sorrowful, but we see from Psalm 3, David has not lost confidence in God. Now look at how God will answer his prayer, verse 32. Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain, again here being the Mount of Olives, where he worshiped God, there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. And we don't know a whole lot about Hushai the Archite. We read about him in chapter 16. Most people seem to think that this city perhaps was located on the border of Benjamin and Ephraim. So you've got a Benjamite here, perhaps, that is coming to David's aid. Again, remember that Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And keep in mind, again, the people of Judah, David's home tribe, had turned on him. Right? Absalom had been crowned king in Hebron, where David's strongest support had been. But not just the Philistines, but here comes this Benjamite, that the response to David being on the run, notice that again, that his robe is torn and that dust is on his head. Also a sign of mourning. So David said to him, if you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant. Say to previously, so I will now also be your servant. Then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar the priest with you there? Therefore it will be that whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Indeed, they have there with them their two sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came then into Jerusalem. Again, of all the people that you would not expect to come to David's aid, here comes a Benjamite, a person that had been a part of the tribe of Benjamin. Again, that was Saul's tribe. At least in the time of Saul's life, he would not have found a greater supporting base than the people of Benjamin, his own people. And yet it's one of these individuals that comes and is basically going to be a very important servant for David, as we'll see in chapter 16, when it comes to helping David regain the throne. Now, David is smart about how he handles this, right? He understands that Hushai could play a very important role in his plans. And so, notice again that Hushai is going to go and try to offer counsel, again, defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for him. And we'll see that play out in chapter 16, but that message, or at least the mission that Hushai is on, is going to pay off for David in the long run. But it's also going to be an answered prayer from God. Because how is the counsel of Ahithophel going to be turned into foolishness? Well, Hushai is basically going to be able to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. Absalom's going to listen to Hushai to his detriment rather than to listen to Ahithophel. And notice again that David has other allies there, right? You're not alone in this matter. You're not like Elijah, who thought that he was alone dealing with Ahab and Jezebel. You've got Zadok and Abiathar the priests there. They're also not just priests, but they're also on my side as well. And so, again, what you hear, you're going to communicate to me. And so, by the end of the chapter, Hushai goes back to the city of Jerusalem, and Absalom has, at this point, taken over the city and has, in a sense, deposed David for a while as being the king. And so, again, we've seen that David, how his response to sin is, right? He doesn't stop trusting in God. But also notice, too, that for David, whereas a lot of people have turned against him, he still had support from other places, from other unexpected places. And I'm reminded of this about how David has kind of handled and conducted himself in the earlier parts of his life. Again, you remember the times that David had, again, shown mercy to others when, he very well could not have. Whether that had been Saul, whether that had been to these Philistines that we've already seen David encounter in this chapter. David could have very well, it could have been the case that David could have had these Philistines killed because they had fought against Israel. And they weren't native people of Israel. But yet, these Philistines that David had allowed to come to Israel to convert to Judaism, they become a very strong supporter of David at this point in his life. And so David, as we've seen, has not been perfect, but in earlier moments in his life, he did know how to treat people well. He did know the importance of extending mercy, perhaps to individuals that we, if we were personally there, might not wanted to have extended mercy to. And I think in a lot of ways that's paying off for David later in life, because there are still people that don't look at David as a tyrant. Right? There are people that are willing to rally to David's side and to help him out. And that's a good point to bring out about what the church really is, at least one of its main functions. Right? We all fall, even though we're Christians, we all have problems with sin. There are times where we deal with certain problems with sin that it's very hard for us to handle on our own. Whether that's overcoming that sin, whether that's trying to get through the consequences of that sin. And it becomes very easy for us, or at least it becomes easier for us to overcome the problem of sin, not just by relying on the help of God, but also by relying on the help of other people that care, and especially that want to see us, at least spiritually, be made whole once again. And I think in the perspective of David, at least, he's praised God for helping him out, but David also is going to recognize that these loyal individuals are very important in helping him once, at least eventually, be able to return to the city of Jerusalem again. David could not have done this on his own, because he had all these people there to support him. Just like in the church, we have to rely on the help of each other, whether that's in a physical sense, whether that's dealing with sin in a spiritual sense. The church cannot survive if its members don't care about the conditions of one another. And I think that's something that's brought out here by the help that David's receiving from all of these individuals. With that being said, are there any comments on what we've talked about in chapter 15?
I think this just shows that when you're faithful to God, God will never desert you. He's
Right.
always going to provide a way. That's His promise. And then it's up to us to surround ourselves with those that want the best for us, which is, the church.
Right.
It's ironic, I think, like you point out, people that you would not have expected to help David do, and people who you would have expected to help David, such as his own son or such as Ahithophel, they don't. I've got a note in my Bible, I'm assuming it's accurate, that Ahithophel was actually Bathsheba's grandfather. And if that's the case, then maybe, he may have stuck in his mind all these years what David has done to Bathsheba's family.
Right.
And that might be one reason why he defects seemingly so easily.
Right. You never know who your friends are until things get tough. You don't really know who. You really find out the people that care about you when things go really bad in life, because they're going to be there to help you out. And David, while the people of Israel, his own people, didn't support him, he still had help, again, from people that, in a lot of ways, he had helped out in earlier moments in his life. And that's going to come true, at least that'll partially come true here in 2 Samuel 16 as well, when we encounter another person that's going to come to try to help David out in this time frame. But notice 2 Samuel 16. We're going to get through verses 1 through 4, and then we'll pick up in verse 5 next week. All right, notice verse 1. When David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met with him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. All right, now who is Mephibosheth? It was Jonathan's son, right? Saul's grandson. Now, what do we know about Mephibosheth? Yeah, he was crippled. And why? You remember why he was crippled? Yeah, the nurse, when he was an infant, basically dropped Mephibosheth while they were on the run, when the Philistines were capturing territory in northern Israel. She dropped him, he fell, he was crippled. He's been crippled his entire life. Now, what had David done for Mephibosheth, at least earlier in this book? Yeah, he allowed Mephibosheth to eat at the king's table, to take care of him. He also restored at least part of his father's, part of Jonathan's property back to Mephibosheth and his family. Remember again that we noted that a lot of times in that situation, a king who was dealing with a relative of the former king, a lot of times would put that relative to death because he didn't want a challenger to the throne. But again, David had shown kindness to Mephibosheth and his servants. And guess who comes and is going to provide some very necessary provisions for David and his supporters while they are on the run? Well, guess what? It's a servant of Mephibosheth who's going to bring all of these provisions to try to help out David and his people. Again, that shows the importance of treating other people right. David perhaps didn't think that when he was basically providing for Mephibosheth's family, that when Mephibosheth could not provide for his own, David probably wasn't thinking that he's going to need the help of at least Mephibosheth's servant later on. But here we go, right? Mephibosheth's servant's here to help out David, in part because of the kindness that David had shown to Mephibosheth earlier in his life. And thus the importance of treating people right, because that can come back and benefit us later on in life. Notice verse 2 that the king said to Ziba, "What do you mean to do with these? What are these for?" And so Ziba said, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on." Now, keep in mind that at this point in Israel's history, apparently, royalty did ride in on donkeys. There's a lot of symbolism behind David riding in on a donkey at this point, along with Jesus riding in on a donkey when he would enter into the city of Jerusalem in the New Testament. So the donkey was a symbol of royalty, at least for a king to ride on. The bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, the wine for those who are faint in the wilderness to drink. And naturally, these are things that the people need. And perhaps Ziba recognized that as well. Obviously, you don't have stores where you can go and buy things. A lot of times travelers had to rely on the kindness of other people to allow them to go and perhaps pick some of their crops to eat while they were traveling, or to have the provisions with them. But of course, remember that David and his people and the people that support him, had to flee really quickly. You didn't have time to take provisions with you. So all of these things are necessary to help out David and his people to be able to sustain themselves as they are traveling. Now note what David would then respond to with Mephibosheth here, or the Ziba here. Then the king said, "And where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me.'" So the king said to Ziba, "Here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I humbly bow before you that I may find favor in your sight, my lord, O king." Now, it appears that in this context, or at least these two verses, that Ziba has decided that he is going to side with David on this matter. He's going to be loyal to David. Ziba portrays that Mephibosheth, on the other hand, is staying in Jerusalem because he feels that perhaps Absalom may restore, or at least this might be a process of Absalom restoring the kingdom back to Mephibosheth, who, being the grandson of Saul, would have been the rightful heir to the throne, at least if you followed Saul's lineage. At least that's what Ziba portrays it to be. Now we'll see, I believe in chapter 19, that Ziba and Mephibosheth basically don't tell the same story. And David's going to have to deal with that a little bit later on. But this perhaps is the consequence again of Mephibosheth being crippled, right? While it may appear that he's staying in Jerusalem because he's waiting for Absalom to give the kingdom back to him. Naturally, if Mephibosheth is crippled, it very well could be the case that it's very hard for him to get out of the city of Jerusalem. And that'll come to play in chapter 19. But Ziba here is portraying himself as being loyal to David. So the king again said to Ziba, "All that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And while that is a promise that maybe David could not fulfill at this point, because he's on the run, it's a promise that Ziba feels like could be granted and could be fulfilled if Ziba helps David eventually return back to Jerusalem and to become king once again. And so Ziba sees this as an opportunity, at least for himself, to profit off of the opportunity to help out David. And that's going to lead to a big sort of squabble or fight between Mephibosheth and Ziba a little bit later on that David's going to have to deal with. But note again that Ziba was, again, thankful to David. I humbly bow before you that I may find favor in your sight, my Lord, O King. Now, these necessary provisions are very much important for David because they are going to help sustain the people, and that's going to become very important because Absalom is eventually going to attack David and his men. So David's going to need the manpower at least a little bit later on. But the kindness of David in earlier moments in his life is paid off. If you think about if David had killed Mephibosheth and Ziba and the servants of Mephibosheth, when David's on the run here, very well could have been that no one had come to his aid. But all of a sudden, here comes the servant of basically the relative of his former enemy, to help out David and to be very critical in helping David eventually regain the throne in Israel a little bit later on into this book. But are there any final comments on this section before we draw to a close?
Ziba did the right thing, but if he's not telling the truth, he did the right thing, but for the wrong reason.
Right.
Sometimes, even in the church, sometimes people will find a congregation, they're a business person, and they work in the congregation, but the reason they're there is for business context. They're doing the right thing, being in worship and so forth, but they're doing it for the wrong reason. So it's great to do the right thing, but we want to make sure that it is for the right reason.
Yeah, and that'll come out a little bit later on when we get into chapter 19. But if Ziba is lying here, then he is trying to help out David, but he's also trying to look for his own benefit in this. And so we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 19. We're going to go ahead and stop here this morning. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in chapter 16, verse 5, not next Sunday, but a week after.